You board a flight. Your ticket clearly shows your seat number. But when you arrive, someone is already sitting there, and they look at you as if you don't belong there. No one shouted. No one fought. Just a very gentle remark. "Excuse me, I think you're in the wrong place." But that look, have you ever seen it before? The look that makes you wonder, maybe I really shouldn't be here. The woman in this story is a CEO, a leader of a system that the entire airline industry depends on. But at that moment, she was just a black woman being asked to step aside. She could remain silent. She could step aside to let things quiet down. Or she could choose not to leave. If it were you, when the entire airplane cabin is staring at you, when the system is used to choosing someone else instead of you, would you stand firm or step back? This story isn't just about a chair. It's about the value of human life when no one is there to protect them. If you've ever felt like you don't belong, stay with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join us in this story. A story that might make you look back at yourself. Naomi Ellison boarded the plane early one morning before the San Francisco sky had even begun to change color. The soft yellow lights in the first-class cabin reflected off the gleaming metal surfaces and pale gray leather seats. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and damp newspaper. Everything was quiet and orderly, the kind of flight one hopes to simply sit down and disappear from the world for a few hours. Naomi liked flights like these, not because of the luxury, but because they gave her a rare moment of quiet. No meetings, no calls. No one needed her to decide anything for the next few hours. She dragged her small suitcase down the narrow aisle, her other hand clutching a worn-out leather bag. Her white sneakers made almost no sound on the thick, carpeted airplane floor. If anyone glanced at her, they would only see a woman in her 40s, simply dressed with tired but alert eyes. Naomi didn't fit the typical stereotype of first-class passengers. She stopped at the second row, 2A, the window seat, the seat she had carefully chosen 3 days earlier after a week that felt longer than usual. Naomi looked down at her e-ticket on her phone, then looked up again. Someone is sitting there. A white man with salt and pepper hair wearing a dark blue suit had taken off his shoes and placed them neatly under the seat in front of him. He was leaning over to adjust the entertainment screen. A glass of orange juice had already been placed beside him. Naomi stood still. She didn't speak immediately, not because she was afraid, but because in that moment she thought she might be wrong. A small mistake, a very real thing. She took a slow breath. "Excuse me," Naomi said, her voice soft and clear. "I thought this was my seat." The man didn't look up immediately. He slowly pressed a few more buttons on the screen as if Naomi didn't exist. Then he looked up. His gaze swept over Naomi from her shoes, dark jeans, simple gray sweater to her unadorned face. The look lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was long enough for Naomi to recognize something very familiar. "He has reached a conclusion. This seat is 2A, he said, his voice firm. "First class." Naomi nodded slightly. "Yes. I know." The man raised his eyebrows, the corners of his lips curving into a very thin smile. "Then you're in the wrong place." A few passengers around looked up. Then they looked down again. Nobody said anything. Naomi held the phone out, keeping it at a comfortable distance. "My ticket is 2A. He glanced at the screen very quickly. Then he shook his head. "That's impossible," he said. "I fly this route every week. I've been upgraded." Naomi remained still. She neither retreated nor advanced. "The system might be malfunctioning," she said, "but this is my seat." The man sighed, a sigh deliberately loud enough for others to hear. "Miss," he said, his voice growing impatient, "I don't have time for this. Please double-check your ticket. Economy class is at the back." The words weren't loud, they weren't harsh, but they fell into the airplane cabin like a small stone thrown into still water. Naomi felt something very familiar rising in her chest. Not anger, rather an old, weary feeling, as if she had stood in this very spot in a different room in a different setting many years ago. She looked around. No one was looking directly at her. Naomi smiled very slightly. "I'll ask the flight attendant," she said. The man shrugged, turning back to the screen in front of him as if it were all over. Naomi turned and walked forward into the compartment. Each step was slow and controlled. In her mind, a very old question echoed strangely clear. Should I ignore it? She knew the easiest answer. Get another seat. Sit down. Rest. Forget about it. She has done that many times in her life. But that morning, standing in the quiet airplane cabin, Naomi Ellison had no idea that she was about to make a decision that just minutes later would prevent the entire flight from leaving the ground. Naomi Ellison stood by the bulkhead near the front of the cabin waiting for the flight attendant to return. She wasn't leaning against anything. Her back was straight, her hands gripping the straps of her bag. A very familiar posture. The posture of those who have learned not to take up more space than necessary. She looked down at her shoes. The small scuff on the toe of her left shoe was still there from the time she rushed across the Oakland parking lot last week. Naomi had considered buying a new pair. But then she changed her mind. These were still usable, and she didn't really care what other people thought of her appearance anymore. At least that's what she used to think. Naomi Ellison is 46 years old. She's not the type to draw attention the moment she walks into a room. Not tall, not loud, not flashy. But if someone sits with her long enough, they'll notice one thing. Naomi always listens, and when she speaks, people usually fall silent. She grew up South Chicago in a neighborhood where winters were so cold, the wind felt like it was cutting through your skin, and summers were stiflingly hot. Her mother was a night shift nurse. Her father had been a mechanic until the factory closed. Naomi learned to be independent very early on, not because she was taught to, but because she had no other choice. She clearly remembers the first time she was told she didn't belong here. Naomi was 23 years old at the time, the youngest engineer in an all-male meeting room. She had prepared her presentation for 2 weeks, but when she stood up, an older man interrupted her after only 3 minutes. "This idea seems a bit too ambitious," he said. "Perhaps you should let the main engineering team handle it." She was the main technical team member at the time. Naomi sat down, no arguing, no explaining. And that night she cried alone in her cramped rented apartment, not because she felt insulted, but because she realized she would have to be twice as good just to be heard half as well. Years later, Naomi Ellison became the founder and CEO of Sentinel Infrastructure Group, a company that most ordinary people have never heard of, but without it so much would cease to function. Sentinel doesn't sell flashy products, no loud advertising. They build systems that nobody notices until they're gone. Software for security compliance checks. Data authentication infrastructure. Silent layers of protection between people and chaos. Naomi doesn't like appearing in the media. She declines many interview requests, not out of modesty, but because she understands a very simple truth: the fewer people know who she is, the more productive she becomes. And that morning on the Northway Airlines flight, nobody knew who Naomi Ellison was. The flight attendant turned around. She was a woman in her early 30s named Laura Bennett. Her face showed the fatigue of someone who had worked too many consecutive flights. "Excuse me, ma'am," Laura said, her voice polite but quick. "What can I do for you?" Naomi pointed to seat 2A. "Someone's sitting in my seat." Laura glanced in that direction. Gregory Whitman was still sitting comfortably, one hand tapping lightly on the screen, the other holding a glass of water. He looked over, giving Laura a slight nod as if they had agreed on something beforehand. "He said he'd been promoted," Laura said, turning to Naomi. "Maybe there's a system error." Naomi nodded. "So, shall we double-check the tickets?" Laura pursed her lips. She glanced quickly at Naomi's e-ticket. Then she looked back at Gregory. For just a few brief seconds, Naomi clearly saw the hesitation on the flight attendant's face. "It's not malicious. It's a habit, Mrs. Ellison," Laura said, lowering her voice. "The flight is almost ready to depart. I can arrange another seat for you. It's very comfortable." Naomi was silent for a few seconds. A very long list flashed through her mind. The times she had agreed. The times she had given in. The times she had told herself, "It's not worth it." She thought of her daughter, 14 years old, at home with her grandmother, a smart, inquisitive girl. Recently, she had asked Naomi why her mother always had to prove herself better than everyone else. Naomi couldn't answer immediately. "Which other seat is it?" Naomi asked. Laura took a deep breath. "Business. Middle seat." Naomi looked directly into the flight attendant's eyes. No anger, no reproach, just a look. "What about seat 2? Naomi asked again. Laura turned to look at Gregory. He said nothing. He just shrugged as if it were nothing to worry about. "He's a regular customer," Laura whispered. "We try to give him priority." Naomi nodded slightly. She understood. She understood very well. In that moment, a part of her wanted to give up. Just nod, go to the back, sit down, close her eyes, sleep. She was very tired. But then another feeling arose. Not anger, not wounded pride, but something very quiet and very firm. Naomi remembered her mother, a black woman who always wore a white uniform, worked night shifts for 20 years, and never complained. She once said something to Naomi very softly. "If you don't stay in your place, someone else will." Naomi lifted her head. "I want to speak to the cabin commander," she said. Laura paused for a moment. "Ma'am, I think—" "Please," Naomi said still softly. "Just a few minutes." Laura nodded somewhat reluctantly, then turned away. Naomi stood there, in the middle of first class. Amidst the fleeting glances that quickly turned away, she didn't know what she was about to do. Only one thing. This time she didn't want to step aside. And in seat 2, a Gregory Whitman leaned back, completely unaware that his comfort was being built on a decision that would very soon come back to haunt him. The compartment chief stepped out from the front. A man in his 50s with graying hair and the steady gait of someone who had been in this profession for a long time. The name tag on the front of his dark blue vest read, Mark Reynolds. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his voice low and accustomed to solving problems. Laura spoke quickly as if she had prepared her words. "It appears there's been a seat mix-up, sir. The passenger in 2A says he was upgraded." Mark nodded, then turned to Naomi. His gaze lingered on her face a little longer than it did on Laura's, as if he were considering something. "Could you show me the ticket?" he asked. Naomi held out her phone. Mark looked closely. 2A. First place. No other special notes. He turned to Gregory Whitman. "Sir, your ticket." Gregory slowly took out his wallet and pulled out his paper boarding pass. Mark glanced at it, then frowned slightly. "Mr. Whitman," Mark said, his voice still polite, "your ticket is 4C, business class." Gregory smirked. "I'm a regular customer. I've been upgraded several times already. The system probably hasn't been updated yet." Mark didn't answer immediately. He looked back at the screen on his handset. Then he looked up at Naomi. The atmosphere around them began to change. Some passengers stopped pretending to be busy. They listened. "Mrs. Ellison," Mark said, "would you be willing to take another seat while we verify this?" Naomi looked straight at him. "No." The answer was short, clear, and not at all harsh. Mark was a little surprised. "It's only temporary," he added. Naomi shook her head. "I paid for that seat. And right now I don't see any reason to stand and wait." Gregory chuckled softly, a short, dry laugh. "Actually," he said, turning to Mark, "I don't understand why this is so complicated. Clearly this is first class. And she—" Gregory paused, glancing Naomi up and down. "Doesn't look like a first-class traveler." That statement was like a thin yet deep cut. No one said anything, no one objected. The silence spread heavy and oppressive. Naomi felt her heart slow down. She had heard this phrase in different forms so many times, in boardrooms, in restaurants, in the glass corridors of grand buildings. What does similar mean, she once wanted to ask. But then she learned that the question didn't need an answer. Mark cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitman," he said, trying to maintain composure, "we are conducting an inspection." Gregory crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. "I'm just stating the truth. If everyone were in the wrong place and demanding a seat, the system would be in chaos." Naomi turned to look at him for the first time, a real look. Not an angry look, but a look of terrifying calmness. "Do you know," Naomi said, her voice, "even that the system only goes wrong when people deliberately ignore the rules?" Gregory shrugged. "What are you implying?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. She turned to Mark. "I didn't mean to delay the flight," she said, "but I also didn't intend to disappear just because it would be convenient for someone else." Mark sighed. He looked around the compartment, then said, "Mrs. Ellison, could you give me a few minutes?" Naomi nodded. Mark pulled Laura aside. They spoke softly. Naomi couldn't hear clearly, but she saw Laura shake her head. Gently, then more forcefully. Gregory looked up, his voice slightly louder. "What's the problem? We're going to be late." Mark turned around. "Mr. Whitman," he said, "we need you to return to your seat as indicated on your ticket while we process your request." Gregory stared at Mark, unable to believe his ears. "Are you kidding me?" "No," Mark replied. "It's only temporary." Gregory half stood up. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm already sitting here." A few murmurs arose. A man in the opposite seat shook his head slightly. An elderly woman looked at Naomi, then turned away. Naomi stood still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't say another word. Mark was silent for a few seconds. Then he turned to Naomi. If you agree to sit in a different seat, we can compensate you with airline miles. Naomi smiled faintly. It was not a happy smile. Mr. Mark, she said, calling him by his name for the first time. Have you ever had to change seats just because someone else didn't want to get up? Mark froze. He didn't answer. Naomi continued, her voice still low. I'm not asking for preferential treatment. I'm just asking for fairness. Gregory laughed even louder. Fair, he repeated. Are you serious? Naomi turned to him. I'm very serious. That moment lasted longer than usual. A moment no one wanted to break, but no one had the courage to end it either. Finally, Mark said, Mrs. Ellison, if you don't agree to switch seats, I'll have to report this to the cockpit. That could cause a delay. Naomi nodded. You go ahead and do your work. Mark looked at her as if wanting to say something, then turned away. Naomi stayed. Alone. Standing in the middle of the first-class cabin. She could clearly feel the eyes around her. Some curious, some annoyed, some pitying. She thought about the question she'd asked earlier. Was it worth it? And this time the answer came faster than she expected. Have. In seat 2, a Gregory Whitman sat down again, arms crossed over his chest. He was confident he would win, because he had always won in situations like this before. But he didn't know that some people don't win by shouting, and some systems, when disrespected, will react in ways no one could have predicted. The airplane cabin became quiet in a very different way. Not the pleasant silence of before, but a heavy silence, as if the air had thickened, squeezing out every breath. Naomi Ellison remained standing in the aisle right next to the second row of seats. She didn't lean against the back of the seat, nor did she move to the side. She just stood there, calm, patient, a patience honed over many years. Mark Reynolds returned after a brief exchange with the cockpit. His face was more tense than before. Laura Bennett followed her lips, pressed together, her hand gripping a small notebook tightly as if clinging to a support. Mrs. Ellison, Mark said, his voice lower, the captain has been notified. We're trying to resolve this as quickly as possible. Naomi nodded. Thank you, Gregory Whitman snorted. Trying to resolve it, he said loudly. This should have been settled a long time ago. A few passengers turned to look at him, but no one objected. Mark turned to Gregory. Mr. Whitman, please cooperate. I'm cooperating, Gregory replied, his voice tinged with frustration. I just don't understand why we have to halt the entire flight because of such an obvious mistake. Naomi heard every word, but she didn't turn around. She looked straight ahead where the curtains separating the front compartment swayed gently in the air-conditioning breeze. She knew this feeling very well, when the issue is no longer about right or wrong, but about convenience or not. Laura took a step forward toward Naomi. Mrs. Ellison, she said, her voice low but urgent. If you agree to take a different seat for now, we can take off immediately. Then we'll deal with the compensation. Naomi looked at Laura. Her gaze held no reproach, no anger, just a weary look as if she had heard this request too many times in her life. Miss Laura, Naomi said slowly. Do you believe I'm in the wrong place? Laura hesitated. I don't think so. So, why am I the one who has to move? Naomi asked. Laura remained silent. Mark interjected. This isn't a personal matter, ma'am. We're just trying to avoid disrupting the flight. Naomi nodded slightly. I understand. She understood perfectly. She understood that in situations like this, the system would always choose the least troublesome solution. And the one who usually had to give way was the one who caused the least trouble. Naomi Ellison has always been perceived as that. Gregory Whitman, however, disagrees. See, Gregory said, turning to Naomi, his voice sounding like he was lecturing her. Everyone understands how this should end. You're just making things more difficult. Naomi turned to him. This time she didn't avoid his gaze. Mr. Gregory, she said, her voice even, have you ever wondered why things usually end in your favor? Gregory frowned. Are you implying that I'm being favored? Naomi shrugged slightly. I was just asking a question. Gregory smirked. You seem to enjoy asking questions. Naomi didn't answer. She turned to look at Mark. Mr. Mark, she said. I want to ask you something. Mark nodded. Yes. If the person sitting in seat 2A right now looks like you, Naomi said slowly, would you ask them to step aside while they wait for verification? Mark stood still. The question wasn't spoken loudly, but it offered him no escape. Ma'am, Mark said after a few seconds. I don't make decisions based on appearance. Naomi nodded. I believe you. Then she continued, her voice as soft as a breeze across the water's surface. But the system does. That statement left Mark speechless. Laura lowered her head. Gregory frowned. Naomi said nothing more. She had said enough. In her mind, another dialogue was taking place. A wordless dialogue. Just ignore it. I'm tired. It's just a chair. Then another voice, deeper, more familiar. If I step aside today, what will my daughter learn tomorrow? Naomi recalled the time her daughter came home upset because a classmate had told her, "You don't feel like you're from around here." Naomi hugged her tightly and told her that she deserved to be wherever she had worked hard to be. Those words, if she doesn't keep them today, will become meaningless. "Miss Ellison, Mark," said his voice, becoming firmer, "if you continue to refuse to cooperate, we will have to record you as an obstructive passenger." The airplane cabin was filled with a sense of dread. Naomi sensed the change. The atmosphere shifted from persuasion to subtle intimidation. A small step, but one she recognized. She looked at Mark, without avoiding his gaze. "He can take note of whatever he sees fit," Naomi said. "I'm just standing in my place." Gregory chuckled. "How stubborn." Naomi turned to him. "You call that stubbornness?" she said. "I call it self-respect." Mark rubbed his forehead. He looked at Laura. Laura looked back, her eyes showing clear concern. "We're wasting time," Gregory said loudly. "There are hundreds of people behind us waiting, all because one person refuses to budge." Naomi didn't argue. She let the statement hang in the air, letting everyone hear and understand it for themselves. Mark sighed. "I'll go back to the cockpit," he said. "We need to make a final decision." He turned away. Laura followed, quickening her pace. Naomi stayed, alone. In the middle of first class, she heard the clicking of seatbelts, someone coughing softly. Very quiet whispers. She felt a familiar sense of loneliness, but it didn't hurt as much as before. It was like an old friend reminding her that she was in the right place. Naomi reached into her jacket pocket. She touched her secure phone. She hadn't taken it out. She hadn't made a call. She hadn't done anything yet. Not yet. But deep down, Naomi Ellison knew one thing for sure. When a system consistently chooses convenience over fairness, there will come a time when that very system must stop and reflect on itself. And that moment may have been closer than anyone on this flight thought. Naomi Ellison stood still in the aisle, feeling as if time was dragging on. Everything around her moved very slowly. A flight attendant bent down to adjust her overhead compartment. A passenger turned a page of a newspaper. The sound of the auxiliary engine echoed steadily like a distant heartbeat. She suddenly realized she was very tired. It's not the fatigue from standing that's tiring, but the fatigue from having to always stand firm. Naomi took a shallow breath. In that moment, a very practical thought came to mind. Just nod. Just step aside. This would be over. She had done it hundreds of times in her life. In boardrooms where she was the only black woman. At dinners where the waiter always handed the bill to the man sitting next to her. At conferences where people asked her what department she worked in, even though her name tag clearly stated CEO. Each time this happened, Naomi would tell herself, "It's okay. It's not worth the energy." But each time something slightly smaller comes along. A part that's very difficult to name. Naomi glanced toward seat 2A. Gregory Whitman was completely relaxed again. He leaned back, took off his watch, and placed it on the small table as if Naomi's presence was just a minor inconvenience that had been resolved. He believed he had won. Naomi turned away, not because she was afraid of that gaze, but because she didn't want to give it any more strength. Old images began to surface in her mind, very clear. She remembered the small kitchen where her mother used to sit and drink tea after her night shift. The dim yellow light. Her mother always asked the same question, "Are you tired today?" Naomi rarely gave truthful answers. She would just smile and say, "It's fine." She remembered the time her daughter came home with red eyes, telling her that the teacher had mistaken Naomi for the maid at the parent-teacher meeting. Naomi was silent for a few seconds longer than usual. Then she hugged her daughter and said, "Some people see the world through a very narrow lens. Our job isn't to shrink ourselves to fit within that lens." That statement sounded very true at the time. But standing in the middle of the airplane cabin, Naomi wondered, "Am I being too stubborn?" Another voice echoed within her, not loud, but firm. "If I yield today, where is the boundary?" Naomi looked around. The others were waiting. She sensed their unspoken frustration. No one said anything, but she knew what they were thinking. The whole flight was delayed because of one person. She understood that feeling. She didn't want to be a source of trouble for others. That's what she'd been taught since childhood. Don't make noise. Don't cause trouble. Don't make others uncomfortable. Naomi Ellison has lived her whole life by that principle. But that same principle has forced her to step aside many times even when she was in the right. Laura Bennett turned around. The flight attendant stood before Naomi, her face showing clear signs of tension. "Missus." Ellison Laura said, her voice low. "We're really under time pressure. If you agree to switch seats, we could take off immediately." Naomi looked at Laura. She saw no malice in her, just weariness, and the fear of being reprimanded. "Do you believe me?" Naomi asked very softly. Laura froze. Do you believe I'm telling the truth?" Naomi asked further. Laura nodded very softly. "Yes." So Naomi said, "Why should I be the one to give up?" Laura couldn't answer. She bowed her head, her hands clasped tightly. Naomi felt a small wave rise in her chest. Not anger, but sadness. A very old sadness. Very familiar. She turned away, looking out the window. Outside, the runway stretched out the parallel white lines like the choices life always presents: move forward or step back. Naomi wondered if by stepping aside today, anyone would remember this tomorrow. The answer came very quickly: no. But what if she doesn't step aside? She didn't know what would happen. She might be noted down. She might be harassed. She might be labeled annoying. She closed her eyes for a moment. In that brief moment of darkness, Naomi saw an image of her daughter boarding some future flight, perhaps being glanced at, perhaps being suspected, and she wondered, "What do I want my daughter to learn from me?" Naomi opened her eyes. She turned to Laura. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't change seats." Laura swallowed. "Ma'am, if this continues, we might have to escalate. I understand." Naomi interrupted, her voice still calm. "Just get on with your work." Laura nodded, turned away, her steps heavier than when she had arrived. The airplane cabin fell silent again. But this time, it was the silence of waiting, like the calm before a heavy rain. Naomi reached into her pocket again. She touched her secure phone. She didn't take it out. She didn't call. She hadn't decided yet. She just stood there, breathing, listening to herself. And in that moment, Naomi Ellison understood one thing very clearly. Standing firm doesn't always guarantee immediate victory. Sometimes it only brings something very fragile but very important: the right not to disappear. Sitting in seat 2, Gregory Whitman glanced at his watch. He was beginning to lose patience, but he still believed that with a little more pressure the woman would step aside. He didn't know that Naomi had long since passed the point where she could turn around. And when someone has nothing left to give, the next thing they do often causes the entire system to stop and listen. Naomi Ellison said nothing more. After Laura left, the first-class cabin fell into a strange silence. No more arguments, no more explanations, only empty spaces between people where eyes glanced over and then looked away. Naomi stood still in the aisle. Her arms hung naturally at her sides. Her shoulders were relaxed. She wasn't trying to appear tough, nor was she trying to appear weak. She simply stood there, present, as if her very existence were an undeniable truth. Gregory Whitman noticed the silence first. He turned his head, glanced at Naomi, waiting for a reaction, a defense, an argument, a sign that she was about to give up. But there was nothing. Naomi didn't look at him. She gazed straight ahead where the curtain of the front compartment hung silently motionless. Gregory raised an eyebrow, slightly annoyed. He was used to his words eliciting a reaction. This silence disoriented him. "Don't you have anything else to say?" Gregory asked, his voice slightly louder than before. Naomi still didn't answer. A man in the opposite seat cleared his throat softly, then looked back down at his phone screen. A young woman adjusted her seatbelt, her movements somewhat hurried. Silence continued to spread. Mark Reynolds returned from the cockpit. His face was more serious. He looked at Naomi, then at Gregory, as if considering his next move. "We're processing it," Mark said in a formal tone. "Please be patient." Gregory sighed heavily. "I don't understand why we have to make such a big deal out of this," he said. "She's not saying anything anymore. She must have figured it out." Naomi heard it. But she didn't argue. She knew that in Gregory's eyes her silence meant concession, and in many cases he was right. Naomi recalled long meetings where she chose silence to avoid being labeled difficult, times when she didn't respond to offensive emails just to maintain peace, moments when she bit her lip telling herself, "Oh, well, let it go." That silence used to help her survive. But today, this silence is different. Naomi wasn't silent out of fear. She was silent because she had said enough. Everything that needed to be said had been laid out. All the choices were on the table. The rest was no longer in words. Laura Bennett stood at the back of the cabin looking toward Naomi. The flight attendant felt a strange pressure, not from resistance but from the woman's very calmness. It made Laura acutely aware of the disproportionate nature of the situation. If Naomi gets angry, things will be easier. She can be labeled. She can be dealt with. Security can be called. But Naomi just stood there. No disturbance, no threats, no movement. That presence, strangely enough, made things much more awkward. Mark looked at Naomi one more time. He saw something he had missed before. Not stubbornness, but a steadfastness honed by countless setbacks in her life. "Mrs. Ellison," Mark said, lowering his voice. "We need a few more minutes." Naomi nodded. She said nothing. Gregory folded his arms and leaned back in his chair. "I have a meeting as soon as I land," he said loudly, as if to let everyone hear. "I hope the airline will take note of this delay." Naomi remained silent. In her mind, her breathing slowed. She could clearly feel each breath of air entering her lungs. She noticed the faint crackling of the speakers, the slight metallic rattling when someone opened the luggage compartment. Her attention turned inward. "Just stand still," she told herself. "Don't explain. Don't ask permission. That's the hardest part." Because throughout her life, Naomi Ellison has been taught to explain, to prove, to make others feel good. This silence is a conscious choice, an invisible boundary, a boundary that Gregory Whitman didn't immediately recognize. He was starting to lose patience. He looked at his watch, then at Mark. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "She hasn't said anything else." Mark didn't answer immediately. He turned to Laura. Laura shook her head slightly, very softly. Gregory frowned. "This is ridiculous." Naomi heard every word, but she let them pass. She didn't give them a place to take hold. In that moment, Naomi Ellison understood one thing very clearly. When you are silent at the right time, you force others to confront their own actions. No words can conceal the truth that lies at the end of this road. Mark cleared his throat. "Gentlemen," he said, turning toward the compartment, "we would like to ask for a little more time." A few sighs were heard, but no one stood up, no one objected directly. Naomi stood there, steadfast, calm. Gregory Whitman shook his head, muttering something about being too sensitive, and it's a small matter. He didn't know that this silence wasn't the end of the conflict. It's the lull before things change. Naomi reached into her pocket. She touched her secure phone. She hadn't taken it out yet. She hadn't called. But this time, her fingertips lingered longer. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was looking straight ahead, as if contemplating a door that once opened could never be closed the same way. The silence continued. But it was no longer empty. It is carrying a new weight. The plane has not yet taken off. It was a very small detail. But Naomi Ellison noticed it immediately. Time was passing more slowly than usual. The seatbelt sign was still illuminated. The auxiliary engine hummed steadily without rushing. A flight that should have taxied several minutes earlier. Naomi remained standing in the aisle right next to the second row of seats. Her legs no longer ached. Her body had shifted to a different state. Still. Focused. As if before a momentous decision. Gregory Whitman glanced at his watch again. He let out a heavy sigh, clearly beginning to lose patience. "This is taking too long," he said loudly, as if the air around him were an object to be criticized. No one responded. Mark Reynolds stood at the front of the cabin, exchanging brief words with the cockpit via radio. Naomi couldn't hear the conversation, but she noticed Mark's voice had changed. Less confident, more cautious. Laura Bennett stood nearby, clutching a small notebook. The flight attendant no longer looked at Naomi. She gazed down at the floor as if counting the individual stitches on the carpet. Naomi understands that feeling. The feeling of being caught between two opposing forces. Doing it right, and making everything flow smoothly. Throughout her career, Naomi Ellison has seen many talented people get stuck in that position. She took a slow breath. In the pocket of his thin jacket, the secure phone was still there. Light, cold, familiar. Naomi wasn't in a hurry. She didn't take it out right away. She looked around the compartment once more. Faces avoided her gaze. Glances were furtive, and then turned away. Some had begun to sigh. Others frowned. They weren't angry at Gregory Whitman, not angry at the system. They were angry at the delay, and that delay in their eyes was right in front of them. Naomi Ellison. She sensed it clearly. But this time, it didn't deter her. "Just do it," a voice inside her whispered. "Not for them, for myself." Naomi reached into her pocket. Slowly, unobtrusively, without attracting attention, she pulled out her phone. Not a typical smartphone. No flashy colors, no logos. A small, matte black device with a slightly rough surface from frequent use. Laura looked up first. The flight attendant noticed the movement. Her gaze lingered on the phone for a moment longer. Gregory saw it too. He raised an eyebrow. "What are you planning to do?" he asked, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "Call a lawyer." Naomi didn't answer. She turned and stepped aside slightly, just enough so as not to block the passageway. That small gesture caused the atmosphere in the compartment to become tense. It was as if everyone thought, finally she's willing to step back. But Naomi didn't move backward. She simply stood to one side and pressed a single button. The call connected almost immediately. Sentinel Operations, a deep male voice, said, "Clear, calm, not a hint of surprise. This is David Brooks." Naomi held the phone to her ear. "David," she said, her voice low. "It's me." There was a very brief pause. Then the voice became more serious. "Yes, Naomi, I'm listening." Naomi didn't elaborate. She never did. "Activate compliance review," she said. "Operations Infrastructure Protocol. Red 3, internal code." David didn't ask any further questions. He didn't request confirmation. Just a very soft understood. "Scope?" David asked. Naomi glanced around the airplane cabin. Then she looked out the window. The runway was still there, unchanged. "The current plane," she said. "Northway Airlines. Flight from San Francisco to Washington, D.C." There was a silence, a little longer than usual. Naomi David said cautiously. "This will trigger an automated check chain. It could cause delays." Naomi nodded, even though she knew David couldn't see. "I know." "Is there confirmation?" David asked. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked at Gregory Whitman. He was frowning, clearly not understanding what was happening. She looked at Mark Reynolds. He was looking at her, his eyes a mixture of suspicion and worry. Naomi inhaled. "Confirmed," she said. "The call has ended." Naomi put the phone down. She didn't immediately put it in her pocket. She held it in her hand for another second. Then she put it away. Nobody said anything. No ringing, no notification, no immediate change. Gregory chuckled softly. "Are you finished?" he asked. "Can we continue now?" Naomi didn't answer. She returned to her original position, standing still, calm. 1 minute has passed. Then another minute passed. Mark Reynolds received the signal in his headset. He reached for the radio. His eyebrows furrowed slightly. "The cockpit is calling," he said, his voice low. "We've encountered a minor problem." Gregory sighed heavily. "Another problem." Mark didn't look at him. "The system needs more time for verification." Naomi stared straight ahead. She wasn't smiling. She showed no expression at all. Laura Bennett felt her stomach tighten. She didn't know why. She only knew that the atmosphere in the cabin had changed, in a way that was difficult to describe. Naomi Ellison stood there, silent, no explanation, no justification. She knew exactly what she had just done. She didn't turn off the plane. She didn't give any orders to anyone. She only activated one process, a process designed for those times when the system needs to pause and reflect on itself. And when a system starts self-checking, it won't care who's sitting in which seat. It only cares about the truth. Gregory Whitman leaned back, arms crossed. He still believed that everything would return to normal, that this was just an annoying delay, and that the woman would eventually give in. He didn't know that from the moment Naomi ended that call, this flight had entered a completely different phase. There was a period when no one on board except Naomi Ellison knew exactly what was about to happen. There were no explosions. There was no immediate panic. It's just, the flight isn't moving. Naomi Ellison realized it even before any announcement. She was used to moments like this, moments when her intuition told her a chain of events had begun, even though everything seemed normal on the surface. The seatbelt sign was still on. The auxiliary engine was running smoothly. But the plane wasn't taxiing. Gregory Whitman looked out the window, then at his watch. He frowned. "What are we waiting for?" Mark Reynolds stood near the cockpit, listening to the radio pressed against his ear. His face gradually tensed. He didn't say anything immediately, but Naomi noticed his hand tighten its grip. A soft ding sound came from the internal system. not an announcement for passengers, just a technical signal. Laura Bennett stood beside Mark, her gaze shifting between the cockpit and the passenger compartment. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly. Mark didn't answer. He turned around, took a few steps toward Naomi, then stopped, as if he'd realized something and decided to stand still. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice boomed through the loudspeaker. Calm, professional, but there was a slight pause between sentences, as if he were reading each word more carefully than usual. "We are undergoing an additional technical inspection. Please remain seated." A few whispers arose. Not loud, but enough to change the atmosphere. Gregory chuckled softly. "A technical check," he said, his voice sarcastic. "Just in time." Naomi didn't react. She stared straight ahead. In her mind, she was counting, not minutes, but beats. 1 beat after the call, 2 beats, 3 beats. She knew the process, not the details, but enough to understand when the system started asking unpleasant questions. Laura Bennett received a notification on her mobile device. She looked down, then looked back up. Her face turned slightly pale. "Mark," she said, her voice very low. "My device just got locked." Mark turned around. "Lock what?" "The flight records," Laura replied. "I can't access them. It's currently undergoing infrastructure compliance checks." Mark froze. Gregory leaned toward them. "What's the problem?" Mark turned back, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just an additional check, sir." Gregory shook his head. "I've been flying this route for over 10 years. I've never seen this kind of additional service." Naomi heard it. She said nothing. But in her mind, a familiar phrase flashed. "Compliance review initiated." A passenger in the back seat turned on his phone. "No network." He frowned, turned it off, and then turned it back on. "The Wi-Fi isn't working," he said. Another person tried the infotainment screen. The screen froze on the airline logo. It didn't change. A very slight wave spread through the cabin. Not panic, but unease. Mark strode quickly toward the cockpit. The door closed behind him. Laura stood there, her hands clenched. Gregory turned to Naomi. "Do you know what's going on?" he asked, his voice having lost its initial confidence. Naomi looked at him. Her gaze was calm. "No," she said. "I'm just a passenger." That answer baffled Gregory. He looked at her for another second, then turned away. In the cockpit, the captain's voice was lower, faster. Naomi couldn't hear the content, but she could hear the rhythm of someone realizing the problem wasn't as small as they thought. A few minutes passed. The lights in the compartment flickered very slightly. Just once, but it was enough to make a few people look up. "What's going on?" someone whispered. Naomi took a soft breath, then exhaled. Slowly. She remembers the first time Sentinel activated this process in a real environment. Not an airplane, but a data center. Even then, it started with very small glitches. A screen wouldn't load. An access request was locked. An automated process stopped. The system didn't panic. The people did. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice rang out again, this time more slowly. "For safety reasons, we will temporarily keep the aircraft in its current position. Please be patient." Gregory sat up halfway. "Safe," he said loudly. "What's wrong with this plane?" Laura stepped forward, her voice reassuring. "There's no danger, sir." "So why don't we take off?" Gregory asked. Laura hesitated. For a very brief moment. "The system needs further verification." Naomi watched the scene like someone standing outside a play whose script she had already read. She wasn't happy, not gloating, just clear-headed. Another passenger turned to Naomi, his eyes scrutinizing her. "Are you involved in this?" he asked, his suspicion clear. Naomi turned and nodded politely. "No." He frowned but said nothing more. Mark Reynolds turned back from the cockpit. This time his face was different. No longer the manager of a minor problem. He was now facing something far beyond his authority. "We need everyone to stay seated," Mark said clearly. "No standing up. No opening luggage compartments." Gregory folded his arms. "Is there anything you're going to tell us?" Mark looked at him, then at Naomi. Just for a fleeting moment. But Naomi noticed. "We are undergoing an external audit," Mark said. "I don't have any further information at this time." Outside, Gregory repeated. "Who's checking?" Mark didn't answer. The airplane cabin fell into a heavy silence. No one pretended to read the newspaper anymore. No one pretended to sleep anymore. Naomi Ellison stood there, calm, unmoving. She knew that from this moment on, everything had gone beyond the story of a chair. Gregory Whitman began to feel a strange sensation. Not fear, but a loss of control, a feeling he was unfamiliar with. He looked at Naomi again, longer, as if searching for a sign, a crack, a panic, but Naomi just stood there, silent, steadfast. And in that moment, Gregory Whitman realized something that bothered him more than any delay. The woman he thought would step aside seemed to be waiting for this. The silence in first class was no longer neutral. It began to smell of suspicion. Naomi Ellison sensed it all too well, not from the words, but from the way their eyes moved, from the way people looked at her for a split second longer then turned away, from the way the hushed conversations stopped as she walked past. A man in the third row leaned over to his passenger. "Is it because of her?" he whispered, low enough so no one would be held accountable. Gregory Whitman heard it. He looked up immediately. "Finally, someone's speaking up," Gregory said loudly, no longer maintaining his initial politeness. Everything started going wrong from the moment she called. It's no coincidence. Some eyes turned to Naomi, others turned away as if unwilling to get involved. Naomi stood still. She didn't argue. She didn't try to explain. She knew the mechanism. When the system malfunctions, people find someone to blame, and she was the easiest face to pick. Laura Bennett stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Whitman, please lower your voice." Gregory waved his hand. "Are you trying to tell me this has nothing to do with her?" He pointed directly at Naomi. "She's the only one who did something unusual." Naomi turned to look at him. No anger, no contempt. Just a gaze so calm that it made Gregory pause for a moment. "You're saying I caused this?" Naomi said, her voice even. "On what basis?" "Based on logic," Gregory replied. "Everything was normal until she showed up and made a fuss over a chair." Naomi nodded slightly. "So according to your logic, she asked if I didn't exist here, the system would never malfunction." Gregory frowned. "You're twisting the words." Naomi didn't answer. She turned to Mark Reynolds, who had just stepped out of the cockpit again. His face was tired, his eyes strained. "Mr. Mark," Naomi said, "am I being considered a disruptive passenger?" Mark froze. He looked at Naomi, then at Gregory, then at the other faces in the compartment. "No," he said after a second. "She's not causing trouble." Gregory let out a dry laugh. "Really?" We're standing still on the runway, for whom Mark didn't answer immediately. He turned to Gregory. "Mr. Whitman, I request that you return to your seat and maintain order." Gregory sat down, but his eyes remained fixed on Naomi. An elderly woman in the front seat turned around and looked at Naomi. Her gaze was a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Do you know what's going on?" she asked, her voice not at all harsh. Naomi shook her head. "All I know is that the system is being tested." "Why?" the woman asked. Naomi paused for a moment. "Because there's a reason to check," she said. That answer didn't reassure anyone. Another person turned on their phone again. "No network." "This isn't good," he said. "I need to send an email urgently." "Are we in danger?" someone asked. Laura quickly reassured them. "No, ladies and gentlemen, this is just a technical inspection." Gregory gave a wry smile. "They always say that." He turned to Naomi again. "You know," he said, his voice low but audible, "if you had just sat down in a different chair from the start, this wouldn't have happened." Naomi looked at him. "Are you sure?" she asked. Gregory shook his head. "She's so annoying." Naomi didn't argue. She looked around the compartment. The others were listening. Some nodded very slightly as if agreeing with Gregory but not wanting to say it out loud. Naomi felt a deeper weariness than before. Not physical weariness, but weariness from constantly being put in a position where she had to explain her own existence. She thought of the other black women she had met at conferences in meeting rooms, women who had told her stories very similar to today's. Chairs taken, voices drowned out, suspicious glances. Naomi didn't see herself as special. She just saw herself as familiar. Mark Reynolds stepped forward in the cabin, raising his hand slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "please remain calm. We are working with operations." "Which regulatory body?" Gregory asked. "The airline. The FAA." Mark was silent for a second. "An infrastructure partner," he said. "I don't have any more details." That remark made the atmosphere even more tense. "Infrastructure partner," Gregory repeated. "Did you hear?" That he turned to Naomi. "Is he your friend?" Naomi exhaled slowly. "Mr. Gregory," she said, addressing him by his name in a more familiar way for the first time. "Do you believe that things are more complicated than you think?" Gregory chuckled. I believe what I see. Naomi nodded. That's usually the problem. The words weren't spoken loudly, but they echoed clearly in the cabin. Gregory opened his mouth to say something, then stopped. He looked at Naomi longer, as if realizing for the first time that she wasn't afraid at all. A small chime sounded from Laura's device. She looked down, her face turning pale. "Mark," she said, her voice a whisper. "We just received a notification from headquarters." Mark walked quickly over. He looked at the screen, his eyebrows furrowed even more. "What's going on?" Gregory asked, his voice rising. Mark looked up. "We've just been told not to let any passengers off the plane," he said. "And not to interfere with the system. The airplane cabin became quite noisy. You won't let me leave. Why? What's going on?" Gregory stood up abruptly. "No one has the right to keep me here," he said. "I have a schedule." Naomi watched the scene, strangely calm. She knew this feeling, the feeling when people begin to realize that control is no longer in their hands. Gregory turned to Naomi, his gaze no longer mocking. There was something else in it, almost worry. "What did you do?" he asked. Naomi looked him straight in the eye. "I'm just standing in my place," she said. That answer silenced Gregory. And in that moment, something very clear began to take shape in the first-class cabin of the Northway Airlines flight. This incident has a cause, and that cause is right in the middle of them, but not in the way Gregory Whitman thinks. The front compartment door opened very slowly. It wasn't the abrupt opening of a seasoned flight crew, but rather a calculated movement. It was as if the person behind the door was wondering, "What am I about to step into?" Naomi Ellison spotted them first. Two men in dark suits and neat ties stepped into first class. Not flight attendants, not pilots. Instead, they carried the scent of boardrooms, of glass-enclosed corridors, of the power that operated behind the scenes. Right behind them was a woman wearing a Northway Airlines jacket with a small name tag on her chest. Elaine Porter, Director of Operations. The airplane cabin was eerily silent. Gregory Whitman jumped to his feet almost immediately. "Finally," he said, his voice a mixture of frustration and hope. "Someone is taking responsibility." Elaine didn't look at him. Her gaze swept quickly across the compartment as if searching for a fixed point. Then it stopped. Naomi Ellison. She stopped completely. "Miss Ellison," Elaine said, her voice slightly hoarse from the urgency. "Thank you for waiting." A wave of whispers swept through the first-class cabin, not loud, but enough for Naomi to sense the change immediately. Her name for the first time carried a different weight. Gregory frowned, waiting for what he asked. "Who is she?" Elaine didn't answer him. She walked quickly toward Naomi, keeping a distance close enough not to draw too much attention, but close enough that her voice didn't need to be raised. "Miss Ellison," Elaine said, her voice low, "the Sentinel operations team has just confirmed it. We need to speak with you." Mark Reynolds stood still. Laura Bennett opened her mouth to say something, then stopped. Naomi looked at Elaine, calm, unsurprised. She knew this moment would come. She just didn't know it would come so quickly. "Now?" Naomi asked. Elaine nodded. "The sooner the better." Gregory chuckled a laugh that was no longer certain. "Sorry," he said. "Is there something I'm missing?" One of the two men in dark suits turned to Gregory. His gaze was cold and brief. "Sir, please sit down." Gregory froze. "Who are you, please?" Elaine interrupted, turning to look at Gregory for the first time. Her gaze was anything but gentle. "You're slowing things down." Gregory sat down slowly. He was beginning to sense that something was wrong, not because of the words, but because people were starting to let go of him. Elaine turned to Naomi. "Could you come with us for a moment?" Naomi nodded. She followed them toward the front compartment. No one touched her. No one urged her on. Their treatment of her was completely different from just a few minutes earlier. First-class monitors every move. As Naomi and Elaine stood near the cockpit, Elaine lowered her voice. "Mrs. Ellison, let me be frank. The screening procedure that Sentinel activated has spilled over into the underlying infrastructure of this flight." Naomi nodded. "I understand. We received a notification from the FAA," Elaine continued. "They asked us to maintain the status quo. No interference. No overriding." Naomi didn't seem surprised. "That's the procedure." Elaine swallowed. "Do you know this could have a ripple effect?" Naomi looked at her. Her gaze wasn't challenging, just the truth. "I know exactly." Elaine was silent for a second. Then she said, "We need you to call back, to stop the process." Naomi didn't answer immediately. She glanced over Elaine's shoulder towards the first-class compartment. Gregory Whitman was sitting there, his back straight, his eyes trying to remain calm, but his hands were clenched tightly. "Before I do that," Naomi said, her voice still even, "I want to ask one thing." Elaine nodded. "Has the person sitting in seat 2, Naomi said, had their ticket confirmed?" Elaine turned to one of the two men in dark suits. He opened his tablet and scrolled quickly. "No," he said. "The valid ticket for seat 2A belongs to Mrs. Ellison." Elaine turned to Naomi. "We're handling it." Naomi nodded. "Then handle it." Elaine paused slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Naomi said slowly, "let's follow the procedure, as you've always asked me to do from the beginning." Elaine let out a very soft sigh. She turned to Mark Reynolds. "Mr. Mark," she said, "please ask Mr. Whitman to leave seat 2A." First-class passengers held their breath. Gregory jumped up. What he said, "No, this is ridiculous." Mark stepped forward. This time his tone was non-negotiable. "Mr. Whitman, please pack your things and return to your seat as indicated on your ticket." Gregory turned to Elaine. "Do you know who I am?" Elaine looked straight at him. "Right now, that's irrelevant." Gregory looked around. No one was on his side. The eyes that had been silent before now avoided his gaze. He turned to Naomi. "Are you satisfied?" he said, his voice low and sarcastic. Naomi looked at him. "I just want to sit in my place," Gregory chuckled. "And that's why this whole flight—" No, Naomi interrupted for the first time. Not loudly, but clearly. "This flight is at a standstill because someone thinks the rules don't apply to them." Those words fell into the cabin like a heavy object. Gregory opened his mouth, then closed it again. Mark waited. Gregory finally bent down, picked up his briefcase, and pulled his coat out of the compartment. He stepped out into the hallway, walking past Naomi without looking at her. The first-class compartment remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of doubt. Rather, it was the silence of belated realization. Elaine turned to Naomi. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "we apologize for what happened." Naomi nodded. "Thank you. Could you stop the process?" Elaine asked. Naomi looked down into her pocket. The secure phone was still there. She hadn't taken it out. "Before I do that," Naomi said, "I want to make one thing sure." Elaine waited. "Next time," Naomi said, "when someone who looks like me is standing here, they won't have to call to get a seat." Elaine didn't answer immediately. Then she nodded. "I understand." Naomi took out her phone. But she didn't press a button yet. Waiting area of the airplane. And at that moment, everyone understood that the woman standing in the middle of this first-class cabin was not just a passenger. She is the person the system has to listen to. Gregory Whitman stood in the aisle for a few extra seconds after leaving seat 2A. No one said anything. No one urged him. But he could sense the change in the atmosphere. It was no longer against Naomi Ellison. It was pressing back against him. He bent down, adjusting his leather briefcase as if needing a familiar motion to maintain his balance. Then he stepped towards the back of the compartment, each step heavier than the last. Naomi watched. Not with a triumphant look. Not with satisfaction. Just a very human look, a mixture of weariness and alertness. Once Gregory was out of sight behind the partition curtain, Elaine Porter turned to Naomi. "We'll handle the rest," she said, her voice low but firm. Naomi nodded. "I believe so." Elaine looked at her for another moment. "Is there anything else you'd like us to assist you with?" Naomi thought for a moment. Then she shook her head. "No, I just want to sit down." Mark Reynolds immediately stepped forward. "Please come in," he said gently, pulling the curtain aside. Naomi Ellison sat down in seat 2A. The seat was wide, upholstered in leather with a faint scent of new leather mixed with wood. She fastened her seatbelt. Slowly, deliberately, as if she wanted to make sure this moment didn't slip away too quickly. The first-class cabin remained silent. But it was no longer a heavy, oppressive silence. It was more like the calm after a rain shower. Everything was still wet, but the sky had begun to brighten. Elaine turned to Mark. "Mark, we need a full report on this," she said, "including how the situation was initially handled." Mark nodded. "Yes." Laura Bennett stood nearby, her hands clasped together. She looked at Naomi. There was something very different in her eyes compared to before. No more judgment, no more defensiveness, just recognition. "Mrs. Ellison," Laura said softly. I'm sorry." Naomi turned to her. "You don't need to apologize to me," Naomi said. But next time, check the ticket before you check the person. Laura nodded. Very strong. At the back of the compartment, Gregory Whitman sat down in seat 4C. The seat was narrower. The space was more cramped. He set his briefcase down, but kept his hands on the strap. He felt something very strange, not mere shame, rather an emptiness at realizing that the things he had once taken for granted no longer protected him. He looked around. Those who had been silent before were no longer looking at him, not out of hatred, but because there was no longer any reason to pay attention. Gregory bowed his head. In that moment, the words he had uttered began to replay in his mind. You don't look like someone who sits here. Just a chair. Don't make things complicated. He never thought those words had value. But now, he's beginning to understand the value of words isn't always immediately apparent. In the front compartment, Naomi leaned back in her seat. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, not to sleep, but to breathe. She clearly felt the exhaustion wash over her after the tension subsided. A familiar feeling, but this time it didn't bring with it regret. Elaine Porter turned back again. Mrs. Ellison, she said, we've contacted headquarters. The inspection process will stop as soon as the aircraft reconfirms all the data. Naomi nodded. I'll call. She pulled out her secure phone. No rush, no fuss. She dialed the number. David, she said when the other end of the line picked up. We've dealt with the anomaly. There was a brief silence. Then David Brooks replied, Understood. We will narrow down the scope and finalize the process. Naomi nodded. Thank you. She hung up the phone. Almost immediately, a soft ding sound was heard. The cabin lights stabilized. The entertainment screen lit up. Wi-Fi came back on. The captain spoke over the loudspeaker. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are ready to depart. A few sighs of relief were heard. Some people clapped softly, but it was unclear who they were for. Naomi opened her eyes. She looked out the window. The runway was still there, but the feeling was different. The plane began to move. In seat 4C, Gregory Whitman felt a slight jolt as the wheels rolled. He gripped the armrest tightly, not out of fear of flying, but because of a different, more indescribable feeling. He realized that throughout his career he had become accustomed to not having to pay the price immediately. Words, glances, small decisions all went unnoticed. But today, for the first time, he was forced to face the immediate consequences. Not with loud punishment, but with a very quiet reversal of power. Naomi Ellison sat still in the front row. She didn't turn to look at Gregory. There was no need. She thought of her daughter. She thought of the other women who would board different flights into different rooms, into different seats. She didn't believe that one action could change the entire system. But she did believe that each time there was no turning back, the system would be forced to register a crack. Mark Reynolds walked past, pausing briefly. Mrs. Ellison, he said. I wanted to say, thank you for remaining calm. Naomi looked at him. Staying calm isn't always easy, she said. But it's necessary. Mark nodded. We'll do better. Naomi didn't answer. She just smiled very slightly. The plane accelerated. The pressure eased slightly in the back of the seat. The city of San Francisco receded into the distance. And the moment the wheels left the ground, Naomi Ellison realized something very clearly. She didn't win against anyone. She just didn't lose to herself. The plane landed on the Washington, D.C. runway on a pale gray afternoon. There was no applause, no cheers. Just a gentle touch, the wheels landing so smoothly that many didn't immediately notice it. But Naomi Ellison did. She always recognized those transitional moments, the thin lines between before and after. As the plane slowly taxied toward the gate, the first-class cabin fell silent. Not the tense silence of before, but a silence of contemplation. Each person carried their own story, their own interpretation of what had just happened. Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt but remained seated. She looked out the window. The city stretched into the distance, its buildings lower than San Francisco but denser and more somber. Washington always had a different rhythm, slower but heavier. Laura Bennett walked past, gathering up the unused glasses. When she reached Naomi, she stopped. Mrs. Ellison, Laura whispered, if you need any assistance getting off the plane. Naomi shook her head. No need. Thank you. Laura nodded, then hesitated for a moment. You know, she said, her voice so soft it was almost to herself. I've always thought that doing things quickly was best. Today, I think differently. Naomi looked at her. She offered no advice. She just nodded. Sometimes realizing it is enough. At the back of the compartment, Gregory Whitman remained seated. He didn't stand up immediately when the signal light went off, as was his usual practice. He watched the line of people begin to move toward the aisle, but he wasn't in a hurry. He felt something very strange, not fear, not anger, but a sense of being left behind in his own story. A man walked past him, lightly bumping into his arm. "Sorry," the man said, then continued walking without recognizing Gregory. Gregory Whitman, who was used to being recognized, he was the last to stand up. As he walked into the aisle, he glanced toward the front of the plane. Naomi Ellison was standing there, carrying a simple handbag, waiting for her turn to disembark. She didn't turn back. No need. Gregory paused for a moment. He wanted to say something. Not an apology. Not exactly. Perhaps just a phrase to regain a sense of control. But none of the sentences fit. He continued walking. Elaine Porter stood at the airplane door with another man in a suit, not to greet passengers, but to wait. As Naomi approached, Elaine leaned slightly. "Mrs. Ellison," she said. "We've arranged a private car if you need one." Naomi shook her head. "No need. I have a car." Elaine nodded. "Anyway." "Thank you." Naomi looked at her. "I didn't do it to get thanks," she said. "I did it because I didn't want this to happen again." Elaine nodded, this time more slowly. "We'll review the entire process." Naomi walked past, without looking back. Behind him, Gregory Whitman had just stepped out the door when he was stopped. "Mr. Whitman," the man in the suit said, his tone polite but leaving no room for negotiation. "We need a few minutes of your time." Gregory frowned. "About what?" "Regarding an incident on the flight," the other person replied. "And some complaints have been noted." Gregory looked around. Other passengers were walking by. No one paid attention to him. No one stopped. "Now?" Gregory asked. "Yes, now." Gregory sighed. "Okay." Naomi Ellison didn't see that. She had already entered the terminal. The atmosphere in the terminal was completely different from the plane. Spacious, noisy, no one knew who she was. And that made her feel lighter. She picked up her phone and checked her messages. A message from David Brooks popped up. "We have received the preliminary report. The procedure operated as designed. There is no long-term damage." Naomi typed back, "Good." Then another line. "Prepare a memo. I want to review the entire contract with Northway." She put the phone in her pocket. No further explanation needed. As Naomi stepped outside, the cool DC breeze brushed lightly against her collar. She pulled her coat tighter. The familiar car was parked on the side of the road. The driver opened the door. "Hello, Mrs. Ellison." Naomi nodded. "Hello." She got into the car. The door closed. The city began to drift past the window. In her mind, the flight was receding. But it wasn't disappearing. It would be there, like a small but distinct landmark. In another office at the airport, Gregory Whitman sat opposite two airline representatives. One was taking notes. The other was dictating timelines. "We need you to explain some of the recorded statements," the other person said. Gregory folded his arms. "I'm just saying what I think." The man nodded. "We understand. But those statements violate the passenger code of conduct." Gregory chuckled softly. "I'm a regular customer." "That's right," the other person replied. "And that's why the standards are even higher." Gregory remained silent. Elsewhere in the city, Naomi Ellison entered a glass building. The security guard nodded in greeting. The elevator doors opened. As the elevator doors closed, Naomi leaned against the wall. She closed her eyes for a few seconds. It wasn't because she was tired. It was because she needed some space. She thought about the question that had been on her mind all flight. Was it worth it? This time the answer was very clear. Have. Not because of the result. Not because Gregory was asked to leave his seat. Not because the system stopped. But that's because she didn't leave her seat. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. Naomi Ellison walked out her back, straight, her steps steady. Somewhere in the background, Gregory Whitman also emerged from another room, slower, heavier, carrying a new awareness that he didn't yet know how to name. Two people, two paths. We disembarked from the same flight. But they didn't leave it in the same way. Naomi Ellison didn't realize it immediately, as the car rolled down the highway leading to downtown Washington, D.C. She was only thinking about the afternoon, meeting the numbers, and the draft contract waiting on her desk. She was used to putting her emotions aside to keep things going. But the outside world doesn't work that way. As Naomi stepped into the glass building of Sentinel Infrastructure Group, Her phone rang for the first time. Then a second. Then a third. She put down her bag, took off her coat, and looked at the screen. Messages from David Brooks. Messages from the legal department. An email with a short subject line that made her stop in her tracks. Media inquiry, Northway Airlines incident. Naomi closed her eyes for a second. She knew this would happen, but she didn't expect it to happen so quickly. "David," she said when the call connected. "What is it?" David got straight to the point. At least 3 passengers posted about it. 1 in first class, 1 in business class, and an anonymous flight attendant. Naomi exhaled slowly. "What did they say?" "They said there was a seat dispute," David replied. "Then the system was checked. Then the flight was delayed. And they mentioned my name." Naomi remained silent. "The media are asking whether Sentinel interfered with the flight," David continued. "They want a response." Naomi walked to the window. The city stretched out below the slow-moving traffic, flowing like veins. "We're not interfering," she said. "We're triggering a compliance process." "I know," David replied. "But the public doesn't always distinguish between the two." Naomi nodded. "No need for a response yet. Let me think." She hung up the phone. Elsewhere in the city, Gregory Whitman sat in a hotel room smaller than he was used to. His suitcase was wide open, but he hadn't bothered to unpack it. His phone was ringing incessantly. Messages from colleagues. Messages from business partners. A notification from his own company's human resources department. "We need to talk." Gregory reread the viral post. A short video filmed from the back seat didn't fully show his face, but was clear enough to hear his voice. "She doesn't look like someone who would sit here." The caption below isn't long, but it's insightful. "A chair, a system, and a man who thinks the rules don't apply to him." Gregory put down the phone. For the first time in years, he didn't know who to call. At the Sentinel, Naomi Ellison sat down at her desk. She opened her laptop. News was starting to appear. Not yet on the front page, but enough to grab the attention of those in the industry. One article used very careful wording. Sources indicate Sentinel Infrastructure Group activated compliance procedures in an incident on a Northway Airlines flight. Another article was more direct. "Who really controls aviation infrastructure?" Naomi read slowly. She didn't react immediately. She knew the most dangerous thing right now wasn't the criticism, but the fact that the story was being told in the wrong way. David Brooks walked into the room. "The media want interviews," he said. "Northway too." Naomi looked up. "What do they want me to say?" "They want me to say that this was just a technical issue," David replied. "It has nothing to do with a seat dispute. It has nothing to do with personal conduct." Naomi leaned back in her chair. "And what do you think?" David hesitated. "Legally, it's the safe option." Naomi looked at him. "And what about the human aspect?" David remained silent. Naomi turned back to the screen. She read a comment that had been screenshotted from social media. Not striking, not angry, just a short line. "I was once asked to switch seats. I switched, and I still think about it." Naomi closed her laptop. "David," she said, "we're not going to hide behind technical jargon." David frowned. "Are you sure?" Naomi nodded. "Absolutely certain." At Northway Airlines, Elaine Porter sits in a brightly lit conference room. The communications, legal, and operations departments are all present. On the screen is a graph showing rising public sentiment. "We need a statement," one person said. "We can't blame Sentinel," another person countered. "They were just following procedure." "But the public doesn't like to hear about the process," Elaine said, her voice weary. "They like to hear about the people." One person turned to her. "So, what are we going to say?" Elaine looked down at the table. In her mind, she pictured Naomi Ellison standing in the middle of the first-class cabin. Not raising her voice, not threatening, just standing there. "We are telling the truth," Elaine said, "and we are taking responsibility." At the hotel, Gregory Whitman opened his laptop. An email popped up from a longtime business partner. "We are suspending negotiations until clarification is achieved." Gregory read it over and over. He typed a few lines, then deleted them. Typed again, then deleted them again. In the end, he didn't send anything at all. At Sentinel, Naomi Ellison stood before a mirror in her private office. She adjusted her blazer. Her face was calm, but her eyes revealed something else. She was contemplating. If she speaks up, the story will no longer be a minor incident. It will become a larger dialogue, about power, about bias, about how the system operates based on convenience. If she remained silent, things might calm down. No one would be further distressed. No one would be forced to reflect on themselves. Naomi remembered the moment she stood in the aisle. She remembered the question that had haunted her throughout the flight. Is it worth it? She picked up her phone, opened the Notes app, wrote a few lines, deleted, wrote again. In the end, she only wrote one sentence. I didn't stand up to stop a flight. I stood up so as not to disappear. David Brooks knocked on the door. They're waiting for a response, he said. Naomi turned around. Prepare the press conference room, she said. It doesn't need to be too big. David froze. You're going to tell me, Naomi nodded, not to assign blame, not to show off power. She paused for a moment, but to tell the story exactly as it happened. On the other side of the city, Gregory Whitman looked out of his hotel room window. It was getting dark early in D.C. Streetlights reflected off the glass. He opened his phone again. He watched the video again. This time he didn't fast forward. He didn't turn it off. He listened to his own voice again. He listened to every word. And for the first time, Gregory Whitman asked himself a question he had never needed to ask before. What if that person were my daughter? That question doesn't have an immediate answer, but it's there. It hasn't disappeared. At the Sentinel, Naomi Ellison walked into the small press conference room. No fancy backdrop, no big slogans, just a table, a microphone, and a few reporters. She sat down, adjusted the microphone. For a moment, the room was silent. Naomi looked up. I'm not here to talk about a chair, she began. And at that moment, the story officially stepped out of the airplane cabin. It's no longer just Naomi Ellison's story. It's no longer just Gregory Whitman's story. It's no longer just Northway Airlines or Sentinel's story. It has become the story of many people. People who have been asked to step aside just to make things easier for others. The press conference room wasn't large. There was no elaborate backdrop, no logos dominating the frame. Just a square room, sufficient white lighting, a few rows of chairs for reporters, and a simple wooden table at the front. Naomi Ellison sat there, her hands resting lightly on the table. No papers, no phone. She took a slow breath, feeling her heartbeat gradually stabilize. She was used to speaking in front of crowds, in front of boards of directors, in front of investors, in front of rooms full of powerful people. But this was a different feeling. Here, she doesn't represent a report. She represents a very human experience. David Brooks sat slightly to the back, out of focus on the camera. He nodded very slightly when he saw Naomi look up and glance around the room. We can begin now, said one of the organizers. The cameras clicked. Several microphones were pushed closer. Naomi stared straight ahead. No smile, no tension, just a very deep concentration. I'm not here to talk about a chair, Naomi said, her voice low and clear. I'm here to talk about a moment. The room became quieter. The moment someone is asked to step aside, she continued, it's not because they're wrong, but because it's more convenient for someone else. A reporter quickly jotted down notes. Another person looked up. On that flight, Naomi said I was in my seat. I had a valid ticket. I wasn't causing any trouble. I wasn't threatening anyone. But I was asked to change seats several times just so things could go smoothly. She paused for a moment. Not long, but long enough for each word to sink in. I know that feeling, Naomi said. So many people know that feeling. A reporter raised their hand. Do you think this is discrimination? Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked at the questioner. Then she looked around the room. I suppose, she said slowly, this is how the system usually works when no one asks questions. That remark made a few people look up from their notebooks. When people become too accustomed to choosing the least noisy solution, Naomi continued, the one who has to stay silent is often the one who suffers. Another reporter asked, do you think you went too far in triggering the investigation process? Naomi nodded slightly. That's a reasonable question. She placed her hands closer together. I didn't trigger the process to punish anyone. I triggered it because I had run out of options. The room was silent. No one interrupted. When you've said enough, Naomi said, when you've explained enough, when you've been asked to cooperate enough times, sometimes silence and standing still are the only actions left. A reporter in the back row asked, do you think your position as CEO of Sentinel influenced how things ended? Naomi nodded. Yes. No avoidance, no downplaying. And that's the problem, she said. Things shouldn't have ended differently just because of my title. The room buzzed slightly. If I weren't the CEO, Naomi continued, if I didn't have access to those processes, I would most likely have had to step aside. and the story would have ended there. She looked down for a second. Then she looked up. "But I don't want that story to keep repeating itself," a reporter asked in a quieter voice. "What would you like to see changed?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked around the room, at the faces listening, at the people who would rewrite this story in their own way. "I want systems designed to serve people," she said. "Not for people to disappear so the system is easier to operate." At Northway Airlines, Elaine Porter watched the press conference on a screen in her office. She said nothing. She just folded her arms and listened. When Naomi said things shouldn't have ended differently just because of my title, Elaine gently closed her eyes. She thought of that morning, of the initial decision, of how convenience had been prioritized over fairness. She turned to the communications team. "Prepare a statement," she said. "We will be announcing a retraining program on passenger dispute handling procedures." In another office, Gregory Whitman sat in front of his laptop screen. He watched the press conference alone. No one was watching with me. No one was commenting next to me. When Naomi mentioned if I weren't the CEO, Gregory felt his throat go dry. He rewinded a few seconds, listened again, then stopped completely. He recalled the moment on the plane, the way he said, "You don't look like the person who sits here." At the time, he thought it was just a comment, nothing more. Now he realized it was a door. A door he had slammed shut in the face of others simply because he thought he had the right to. Gregory turned off the screen. "Sit still." In the press conference room, one reporter finally asked, "Are you afraid of a backlash? That your speaking out will make things more difficult for people like you?" Naomi thought for a moment. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'm scared." The room was completely silent. "But I'm even more afraid," Naomi continued, "if we continue to remain silent and call it peace." She looked directly into the camera. "Silence isn't always neutral," Naomi said. "Sometimes it's just delayed consent." Some people swallowed. Some people stopped typing. Naomi sighed softly. "I'm not asking anyone to stand up like me. I just hope that next time when someone is in their place, they won't be asked to disappear for convenience." She nodded slightly. "Thank you." The press conference ended quietly. No slogans, no bombastic pronouncements. But the room left with a different atmosphere, a slight unease, and an unanswered question. Outside, the news started spreading faster. Not because it was sensational, but because many people saw themselves in the story. "This has happened to me before. I was also asked to change seats. I stayed silent and I still regret it." Those lines appear everywhere. Naomi Ellison returned to her office. She closed the door. She sat down in her chair. The room was strangely quiet. David Brooks knocked on the door. "The reaction was very strong," he said. "Mostly positive." Naomi nodded. "And what about Sentinel? We're going to be scrutinized," David replied. "But I already knew that." Naomi smiled very slightly. "Yes." She turned to the window. It was completely dark in D.C. City lights reflected off the glass, creating overlapping patches of light. Naomi wondered where this story would lead. Some people would understand. Some would object. Some would say she was overreacting. She accepted everything. Elsewhere in the city, Gregory Whitman sat on his hotel bed, phone in hand. He opened an unsent message, typed a few words, then deleted them. For the first time, he didn't know what to say, not because he lacked the words, but because he wasn't sure he was ready to face them. At Northway Airlines, Elaine Porter signed a document titled Revised Passenger Dispute Protocol. She paused for a second, then signed. At Sentinel, Naomi Ellison stood up, put on her coat, and prepared to leave the office. Before turning off the lights, she looked back at the room. She didn't know how much today's speech would change things, but she knew one thing for sure: she didn't disappear, and sometimes that alone is enough to start a movement. A week after the press conference, things calmed down. It doesn't disappear, it doesn't end, but it subsides in the way that big waves often do after they've crashed hard enough against the shore. Naomi Ellison realized this on a very ordinary Monday morning. She arrived at the office earlier than usual. Washington, D.C. was still half asleep. The streets weren't crowded with cars. Faint sunlight filtered through the glass buildings, reflecting in soft patches of light on the stone floors. Naomi put her bag down and poured herself a cup of coffee. She didn't open her laptop right away. She stood still for a moment, looking out the window. She thought about that flight, not in an obsessive way. Rather, it's like remembering a moment that turned life in a different direction. David Brooks walked in carrying a thin stack of documents. "Just wanted a quick update," he said. "Northway has officially implemented the new process. And a few other companies have contacted us." Naomi turned around. "For what reason?" "Because of internal training," David replied. "They don't say it directly, but everyone understands." Naomi nodded. "Good." David hesitated. "There's one more thing." Naomi waited. "There's a letter that arrived," David said. "Not an email. A paper letter." Naomi was slightly surprised. "Who sent it?" David handed over the envelope. "Gregory Whitman." Naomi took the envelope. It had no logo, no company seal, just a handwritten address, slightly shaky. She didn't open it right away. She placed it on the table, looked at it for a few seconds. "You don't need to read it," David said. Naomi shook her head. "No, I want to." She opened the envelope. Inside was a piece of paper folded in half. The handwriting wasn't neat, but it was clear. "Mrs. Ellison, I am not writing this letter to justify myself. I am writing because for the first time in my life I realize that there are words that cannot be taken back, only learned not to be repeated. I don't know if my apology means anything to you, but I still want to say I am sorry, not for what happened to me afterward, but for what I did before." Naomi read slowly. She was expressionless. She didn't react strongly. She folded the letter. "Put it in the drawer." David looked at her. "Are you all right?" Naomi nodded. "Okay, and she's actually fine. It wasn't because the letter erased anything. It was because she no longer needed it to feel like she was right." Elsewhere in the city, Gregory Whitman emerged from a low-rise building. It was no longer his familiar glass-enclosed office, just a small training center where he was participating in a mandatory consulting program mandated by his company. He didn't become a better person in just 1 week. There was no grand redemption, no climax. There were only silent sessions, uncomfortable questions, and a new realization that power is not something you possess permanently, but something you are lent as long as you know how to use it. At Northway Airlines, Elaine Porter stood in an internal training session, not as a speaker, but as an attendee. She sat in the second row. In front of her was a simple slide. "Passenger first doesn't mean passenger who looks important." Elaine took notes. Slowly, clearly. She thought back to that day, to the initial decision, to the convenience that had been chosen over fairness. She didn't forgive herself right away, but she began to learn how not to repeat the mistake. At Sentinel Infrastructure Group, Naomi Ellison walked into a different kind of meeting. Not a press conference, not a media event. It was a closed-door meeting with the management team. Someone asked, "Do we need to build an image of Sentinel associated with this story?" Naomi shook her head. "No." The other person was surprised. "But this is an opportunity." Naomi looked around the table. "If we turn this into a campaign," she said, "then we'll miss the whole point." The room was silent. "We don't need praise for doing the right thing," Naomi continued. "We just need to keep doing the right thing, even if no one is watching." No one objected. A few days later, Naomi Ellison boarded another flight. No cameras, no posts, no media coverage. Just a normal domestic flight. Economy class. Middle row. She sat down, fastened her seatbelt. Looked around. A young woman sat next to her. She was simply dressed, clutching her handbag tightly, and her eyes showed a hint of worry. When the flight attendant came to check her ticket, the girl was a little flustered and handed over the wrong card. Then she apologized repeatedly. "It's okay," Naomi said softly. "Everyone goes through this sometimes." The girl looked at Naomi. She smiled slightly. "Thank you." No one changed seats. No one was asked to move aside. The plane took off on time. Naomi leaned her head back against the chair. She closed her eyes. She thought of a phrase that had appeared so many times in the past few days. In the newspapers. Online. In conversations. One chair changed everything. Naomi disagreed. The chair hasn't changed at all. What changes is the moment a person decides not to disappear. Somewhere online, the story is gradually being retold. There aren't many details left. Right and wrong are no longer clearly defined. Only one very simple thing remains which many people keep to themselves. Next time I won't stay silent. Next time I'll check my ticket first. Next time I'll stand in my proper place. Big changes rarely begin with a bang. They begin with one person, not stepping aside when asked. Naomi Ellison opened her eyes as the plane pierced through the clouds. White light flooded the cabin. She doesn't think of herself as an icon. She doesn't think of herself as a hero. She was simply someone who was tired of having to explain that she belonged there. And this time, she didn't explain anymore. The plane flew steadily. No shaking, no problems. Things continue as usual. Life goes on. But somewhere very subtly, a standard has shifted. Quiet. No announcements. It's just that, next time when someone is in the right place, there will be one more person who thinks twice before asking them to leave. And sometimes, that's a beautiful ending. This story doesn't teach us to protest loudly, nor does it encourage extreme confrontation. The most important message it conveys is that a person's worth doesn't come from where others allow them to be. Many of us, especially those who have lived half our lives, have become accustomed to giving way to avoid trouble, giving up our seats, giving up our voices, giving up opportunities. Not because we are wrong, but because we don't want to get tired. But each time this happens, something very small within us is eroded. It's the feeling, do I truly belong here? The biggest lesson of this story is, you don't need to prove you deserve it. You already deserved it from the start. Sometimes the bravest thing to do isn't to retaliate, but to refrain from stepping out of your way just to make others feel more comfortable. And here's a beautiful thing: when you don't disappear, you're silently paving the way for those who come after you. Not everyone has the power that the character in the story possesses, but everyone has the right to maintain their dignity. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Thank you for taking the time to listen, reflect, and feel. If this story reminds you of a moment in your life, please like, share the video with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Stories about people, dignity, and hope that are so relatable. See you in the next video.